Today we're taking a look at the Kohler Highcliff, one of the more original designs, but we're basing this review around the 3.5 Waterguard version. But I'm kind of counting it as both this and the older ones as the same exact review, because besides some minor differences like the base and water usage, they're pretty much the same toilet if you think about it. But if I ever change my mind, I'll do the older one later. But for now, we're focusing on this one as just a basis for the older Highcliff in general. Let's start off with the overall design, which definitely has a little bit of age to it, but also doesn't look too old. It's some kind of interesting middle ground, I must say. Inside the bowl, there's the trapway opening. It's just a simple circular opening, or it looks like it. And it actually has a pretty deeper bowl than usual. Since this doesn't have exposed siphon jets, the siphon jets are actually tucked in the back of the opening lip. So that's actually how it's powered and gets stuffed down, which is pretty interesting. Let's have a look at a flush. Not bad at all. Now, it's obviously noticeable on the older one that the flush is a little bit longer, but honestly, is it that much longer? The flushing style is about the same on the older one. It's just a little bit longer because of the 4 to 5 gallons it uses. But this one only uses 3.5, but still has a pretty good long flush. Now, obviously, depending on pressure, it could be a lot more interesting in terms of flushing, but I kind of like it at this medium pressure on this one. The pulling power and siphon are also pretty adequate too, actually focusing more on the siphon and some flushes. Now, on higher pressure, it's a little bit less like that, but not too bad by any means. Compared to some other toilets that struggle to get some stuff down, especially floaters, this actually does pretty well. The performance is also not bad either. It's not perfect by any means. Compared to a Downing, and yeah, it'll get beat, but the performance actually still does pretty well for what it is. I think some problems might lie in the trapway opening sometimes, but it's honestly a rare problem, thankfully. Now, I think my biggest problem with this toilet is actually the bowl ones. Let's have a look. While it looks perfectly fine to most people, the bowlines on these are just not very good. The back rim definitely has a lot of stains scattered up on some occasions, and that's just not a great sign. It's not the worst ball runs ever, but it definitely could have been a lot better implemented, especially considering that it swirls, which is pretty disappointing. And that is the older Kohler Highcliff toilet. A pretty neat toilet with a lot of cool features. Granted, some things are better than others, and honestly some things are a bit lacking compared to toilets like the Kohler Downing, but this is still a pretty cool toilet, and it actually holds up fairly well for what it is. But let's grade it. For the overall design, the Kohler Highcliff has a pretty interesting mixed design. While yes, it's definitely basic, don't get me wrong, this has a strange mix of looking not too old, but not too new as well. It's this interesting middle ground, I must say. But for the later designs, the 80s and 90s, it's definitely not too interesting. This one's getting a 5. Quality control isn't too bad. These things function pretty well and rarely have problems, with maybe the most being some of its ball runs, but we'll get to that later. Overall, this thing functions pretty well and rarely has problems. I give it a 7. These things are pretty consistently designed. The trapway openings always look consistent. The flushes are pretty much more or less the same. It really depends on pressure though. But these things are pretty consistent overall. Maybe some crookedness here or there, but it's something that's kind of rare. Overall, it gets a 9. The trapway isn't really anything to write home about, but I honestly think there's better trapway designs out there. I have noticed that this thing tends to have a little bit more issues with its size compared to some other stuff, but honestly, it's perfectly alright. But it definitely lacks in comparison to something like the Downing, and I give it a 6. Flush is actually not that bad at all. It's a pretty standard swirly flush, but it does have an emphasis on getting stuff down, which is pretty nice, considering that most other toilets tend to struggle with that. So that's a good sign. The flush itself isn't really anything original per se, though. We've seen it flush 1,000 times, so I'm only going to give this a 7. The pull and siphon are pretty decent too, getting stuff down pretty well on most pressures. Maybe on higher pressure you might struggle a little bit, especially with floaters, but compared to some other toilets from the time, it definitely handles it a lot better. The siphon is pretty decent too, considering the fact that it has concealed siphon jets. I give it a 7. The performance is also pretty well too. Not amazing per se. Compare this to a Downing and it will get beat in a heartbeat. This thing might clog a little bit more, quote unquote, frequently compared to some other 3.5 Kohlers of this timeline. But it's still not a bad performance by any means, but it's just a lacking compared to something like, say, a Downing. It's kind of on par with the 3.5 Welcome, but it has a slightly bigger trapway compared to that. I give it a 7. If I have one complaint about this toilet, the ballast just isn't that great. While it does have angled siphon jets, this thing tends to get stains on the back rim every now and then. Thankfully not as common as others, but still not a great look. This definitely could have been improved though. It gets a 5. These things could survive a pretty good long time. Sure, the performance isn't as good as some other toilets from this timeline, but it still can hold its own by itself and can last a pretty good long time in a normal setting. I'm giving it an 8. Now let's talk about the overall value of this thing. This thing is pretty interesting how it's executed. While it's not bad per se, I definitely think it's one of the more slightly lacking fixtures. Maybe besides the Kohler Welcome, that's an entirely different story. But the Kohler Highcliff, despite some of its issues, still holds up pretty well. Sure, the bow rinse isn't really good for its time, but it flushes pretty well, it siphons out pretty well, it pulls pretty well, and even though the performance is definitely one of the more lacking, it still doesn't perform bad per se. While I definitely think there are some better toilets from this timeline, the Kohler Highcliff is not too bad at all. And because of that, I'm giving it a 7 in value. The final score of the older Kohler Highcliff toilet, particularly the 3.5 gallon model, is a 68 out of 100. These are pretty interesting toilets overall. Definitely not the most original, nor is it really the best, but it's still not bad by any means. These things function pretty well and hold up pretty well despite some other Kohler models being, technically speaking, a little bit better. It's still pretty cool that they came up with this model, especially during the 60s, which is a time where ADA toilets were not really common. And even though the Waterguard is a little bit weaker in terms of score compared to the original Highcliff, it still holds up pretty well.